June 4th, 1943. A train cuts through the Texas darkness. Inside, 1,850 German soldiers stare through the windows at something impossible, something that will shatter everything they believe about the war, about their enemy, and about themselves. The pencil shook in his hand. Under-Officer Werner Burkhardt pressed it against the pages of his hidden diary. Contraband that could earn him solitary confinement if his own officers discovered it. But he had to write. He had to record what he was seeing, because no one back home would ever believe it. Through the window of the Pullman coach, electric lights blazed across the Texas plains. Not just a few scattered bulbs. Not the dim, rationed glow of wartime necessity, but a constellation of brilliance. Every farmhouse, every street corner, every shop window burning bright at 10 o'clock at night. The Americans must be lying to us, Burkhardt wrote. No nation could possess such abundance while fighting a war on two fronts. For 3 years, Nazi propaganda had painted a picture of America as a nation on the brink of collapse. A mongrel country weakened by democracy, crippled by diversity, unable to match the industrial discipline of the Third Reich. Back in Germany, blackout regulations had plunged cities into darkness since 1940. Rural electrification barely reached 20% of farms, even before the war began. Yet here, in what should have been the heartland of American decay, electricity flowed like water. The train slowed as it approached Mexia, Texas. Inside, 1,850 veterans of Rommel's Afrika Korps prepared to step into captivity. They were elite soldiers, men who had driven the British back to the gates of Egypt, warriors who had earned even Montgomery's grudging respect. Now they were prisoners. But something about this captivity didn't add up. They weren't traveling in boxcars or freight wagons. They rode in cushioned Pullman coaches with dining cars and sleeping berths. They'd been fed better on this journey than they'd eaten in 6 months of desert warfare. None of them understood yet what was happening. They were about to witness something more devastating than any battlefield defeat. They were about to see America's secret weapon, the one that would win the war before a single shot was fired in their presence. They were about to discover the truth. The collapse had come suddenly. On May 13th, 1943, in Tunisia, approximately 250,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered. The Wehrmacht's most experienced desert fighters, men who had seemed invincible just months before, laid down their arms in defeat. Among them was Feldman Friedrich Radke, holder of the Iron Cross First Class, veteran of the France campaign, wounded twice in North Africa. His diary, discovered decades later in the National Archives, will become one of the most detailed accounts of what happened next. The psychological demolition began almost immediately in the port of Oran, Algeria. 30,000 prisoners waited in makeshift camps for transport ships. The U.S. Army processed them with organizational precision that exceeded anything most had witnessed in the Wehrmacht. Identity cards photographed, medical examinations completed, inoculations administered, Geneva Convention rights explained in fluent German by American officers trained specifically for this moment. Then came the first shock. The food, Oberfeldwebel Hans Muller, captured with the 21st Panzer Division, would write to his mother 8 months later with barely concealed astonishment. In the cage at Oran, while we waited for ships, the Americans fed us better than we had eaten in 6 months of desert warfare. White bread, real coffee, meat twice a day. We thought it was propaganda, that they were trying to impress us. We didn't realize this was their standard military ration. The Liberty ships that carried them across the Atlantic were themselves monuments to American industrial power. Each vessel had been built in days, not months. At peak production, 3 rolled off the assembly lines every single day. The prisoners didn't know this yet. They would learn. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmerman of the 90th Light Division kept detailed notes during the 2-week Atlantic crossing. What he recorded reveals the moment German soldiers began to understand the true nature of their enemy. The ship's crew disposed of more food waste each day than my entire company had received in weekly rations during the final months in Africa. American sailors threw away half-eaten steaks, whole loaves of bread, gallons of milk that had sat too long. They did this openly, without thought not to mock us, but because to them this waste meant nothing. Their supply was limitless. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Stauberg, whose aristocratic Prussian family had served in every German war since Frederick the Great, stood on deck as the ship approached the American coast. He watched the radar antenna rotating above the bridge. Radar, technology the Germans believed only they and perhaps the British possessed, in limited quantities. Here it was standard equipment on a cargo vessel. It was then, von Stauberg would write years later, that I first suspected Germany had already lost the war. August 2nd, 1943, Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. The first sight of American soil shattered the last remnants of what German prisoners believed about their enemy's weakness. The base sprawled across 4,300 acres, dozens of ships loaded and unloaded simultaneously, their cranes moving with mechanical precision. In a single day, this one port handled more tonnage than all of Hamburg managed in a week. Gefreiter Johann Weber, a factory worker from Ruhr before his conscription, counted 47 cargo ships in various stages of operation. He noted in his secret diary that each crane lifted loads that would have required a dozen men and horses back home. They moved smoothly, continuously, powered by electricity rather than coal smoke. But nothing prepared the prisoners for what came next. They marched through parking lots filled with hundreds of civilian automobiles. These weren't official vehicles or military transport. These were the personal cars of dock workers, ordinary laborers who drove to work in their own automobiles. In Germany, private car ownership remained a privilege of the wealthy and party elite. The Volkswagen, promised to the German people since 1934, remained a propaganda dream. Fewer than 1,000 had ever been delivered to civilians. Here, dock workers drove Fords and Chevrolets to their shifts. Then came the trains. Not boxcars, not the 40 and 8 wagons that carried German troops, 40 men or 8 horses across occupied Europe, but full passenger coaches, Pullman cars with padded seats that converted to sleeping berths, dining cars with white tablecloths and silver cutlery, observation cars with panoramic windows. Feldman Radker wrote with barely suppressed disbelief, "We boarded like tourists, not prisoners." The American guards seemed almost embarrassed by the comfort. One sergeant apologized that the air conditioning wasn't working properly in our car. Air conditioning. In August, we had believed such luxury existed only in Hitler's personal train. The 3-day journey from Norfolk to the camps of Texas and Oklahoma would prove more devastating to Nazi ideology than any military defeat. As the trains rolled west through the night, German prisoners pressed their faces against windows and witnessed an America that couldn't exist according to everything they'd been told. Every small town blazed with light. Martinsville, Danville, Greensboro, communities that in Germany would have been lucky to have a single electric street lamp displayed illuminated shop windows, electric signs, houses with lights burning in multiple rooms. They passed factories running night shifts at midnight, their windows glowing, parking lots still full. Oberfeldwebel Meyer, whose father was a Nazi party bloc leader in Hamburg, wrote in a letter discovered decades later, "We passed through dozens of cities that first night. Everyone had more electricity than all of Hamburg. The guards told us this was normal, that every American town had electricity since the 1920s. I called him a liar. He just shrugged and said we would see." In Roanoke, Virginia, the train stopped for water and coal. German prisoners watched American railway workers complete in 30 minutes what would have taken 2 hours back home. Automated coal loaders, electric water pumps, mechanized lubrication systems. But it was a casual wealth of the workers themselves that proved most disturbing. They wore leather boots that would have cost a German laborer 2 months' wages. They drank Coca-Cola from glass bottles and threw the empties away without thought. They smoked cigarettes continuously, stubbing them out half-finished. Feldwebel Heinrich Muller, an electrical engineer from Siemens before the war, calculated that the single railway yard they'd stopped more electricity in 1 hour than his entire district in Berlin used in a day. The waste was magnificent, he wrote. They left lights burning in empty buildings. Electric fans ran in vacant rooms. It was the carelessness of infinite resource. As the trains crossed Tennessee and Kentucky, the scale of American industrial power became impossible to deny. Through the windows, prisoners watched factories that dwarfed anything most had seen in Germany. The Alcoa aluminum plant in Tennessee stretched 3 miles along the river, its electric furnaces consuming more power than the entire city of Munich. Near Louisville, they passed the Rubbertown complex, for massive synthetic rubber plants that had risen from empty fields in just 18 months. Together, they produced 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber annually. Germany, despite inventing the process, had never managed more than 120,000 tons in its best year. Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann, a chemist from IG Farben, grasped the implications immediately. In a post-war interview, he recalled with clinical precision, "I knew those plants. I could see the distillation columns, the catalytic crackers. Each facility was more advanced than anything we had built, and there were 4 of them just in this one location. They told us there were dozens more across the country." The trains passed Ford's Willow Run plant outside Detroit. This single factory, built in just 9 months, produced AB 24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. At peak production, 42,000 workers assembled bombers from 1.5 million parts manufactured by 1,500 subcontractors. The plant consumed 2.5 million square feet of floor space. It used more electricity than the entire German city of Cologne. Hauptmann Werner, a Luftwaffe pilot shot down over Tunisia, pressed his face against a window and counted 17 B-24s in various stages of completion, visible from the train. "We had been told American planes were inferior, hastily built, that they would fall apart in combat," he would later write. "But I could see the precision of the assembly lines, the quality of the construction. These were not inferior aircraft. They were simply built faster than we could imagine possible." The deeper they traveled into America's heartland, the more complete became the destruction of everything they believed. In St. Louis, they crossed the Mississippi River while below them, barges carried more grain than Germany's entire harvest of 1942. They could see grain elevators stretching along both banks, each one holding enough wheat to feed a German city for months. Underofficer Carl Schmidt, a farmer's son from Bavaria, wrote, "The Americans transport food as we transport ammunition, in endless quantities without concern for loss. I watched them loading a single barge with enough wheat to feed my entire village for 5 years. The crane operator was eating a sandwich with meat thicker than our weekly ration." In Kansas City, the train stopped at massive stockyards where tens of thousands of cattle waited for slaughter. German prisoners who had subsisted on 200 grams of meat per week, when lucky, watched American workers eating beef sandwiches during lunch breaks. "They ate meat like we ate bread," wrote Gefreiter Paul Fischer. "No, that's wrong. They ate meat like we wish we could eat bread." The camps themselves delivered the next wave of cognitive demolition. Camp Hearne, Texas, had been built in just 4 months. It housed between 3,000 and 4,800 prisoners in conditions that exceeded what most had known as civilians in Germany. Wooden barracks with electric lights, flush toilets, hot showers, steam heat, each building constructed with more lumber than entire German villages possessed. The camp hospital astounded German medical personnel. Oberstar's Dr. Friedrich Bauer, chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division, found himself in a facility better equipped than most German civilian hospitals. X-ray machines, modern surgical equipment, pharmaceutical supplies that had been unavailable in Germany since 1941, all standard provision for enemy prisoners. They had penicillin, Dr. Bauer would later testify with lingering disbelief. This miracle drug that we had only heard rumors about. They used it freely, even on prisoners with minor infections. German soldiers were dying for want of basic sulfur drugs, and the Americans were giving us their most advanced medicine without hesitation. The camp kitchens became another classroom in American prosperity. Prisoners assigned to cooking duties discovered walk-in refrigerators, electric mixers, automated dishwashers, and gas ranges that could prepare meals for 5,000 men. The daily ration included fresh milk, eggs, meat, vegetables, and white bread, quantities German civilians hadn't seen since 1939. Feldwebel Otto Krebs, a former hotel chef from Munich, wrote with barely contained emotion. Today we threw away more food than my family has seen in 3 years. Not spoiled food, simply excess. American regulations require we prepare 10% more than needed to ensure every prisoner receives full rations. The surplus is discarded. I wept as I threw perfectly good bread into the garbage. By September 1943, labor shortages in American agriculture led to prisoners being employed in fields and factories across the country. This decision, driven by wartime necessity, would prove more destructive to Nazi ideology than any propaganda program could have achieved. Prisoners were trucked daily to work sites, traveling through America's heartland without blindfolds or restricted routes. They saw everything. At a cotton gin outside Houston, Under-Officer Herbert Lang watched a single machine process more cotton in 1 hour than his entire Bavarian village could have handled in a month using traditional methods. The farmer who owned the gin was nobody special, not aristocracy, not a party member, just a farmer. Yet he had electricity, running water, a truck, a car, and a tractor. His workers, including Black Americans, ate lunchroom boxes containing more food than German workers received in a week. And this was normal, Lang recorded with growing comprehension. Every farm we passed was the same. In Nebraska, prisoners worked sugar beet fields and witnessed agricultural mechanization that defied comprehension. A single combine harvester could do the work of 100 men. The field stretched to the horizon, each one larger than entire German counties. Farmers spoke casually of yields that would have been fantasy in Germany. 60 bushels of wheat per acre compared to Germany's 30 on the best land. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann, working on a farm outside Scottsbluff, wrote, "The farmer's son, a boy of 16, drove a tractor worth more than everything my father had earned in his lifetime. When I mentioned this, the boy laughed and said it wasn't even a particularly good tractor. His father was waiting for a new model from John Deere that would be even better." The most devastating revelations came to prisoners who worked near American factories. At a Campbell soup factory in New Jersey, they watched production lines process more tomatoes in a single day than most German factories handled in a month. The facility operated with a skeleton crew of women and elderly men. Most young workers were in the military. Yet production exceeded peacetime levels. Stabsfeldwebel Ernst Wagner, who had worked in a German food processing plant before the war, documented it with technical precision. Everything was automated: electric conveyor belts, automatic filling machines, steam cookers that processed hundreds of cans simultaneously. One elderly woman monitored controls that managed what would have required 50 workers in Germany. She did this while listening to a radio and drinking coffee. Near Detroit, prisoners unloading coal at a power plant glimpsed the River Rouge complex across the water. The plant employed 100,000 workers producing jeeps, aircraft engines, and tanks. It consumed 1.5 million kilowatts of electricity daily, more than the entire city of Hamburg. We could see the parking lots, wrote Oberfeldwebel Franz Kellner. Thousands of cars belonging to workers. In Germany, even our officers rarely own cars. Here, factory workers drove to work. The guard told us many workers owned 2 cars, one for work, one for family use. We thought he was mocking us. By winter 1943, American intelligence officers documented what they called ideological collapse syndrome among the prisoners. The Special Project Division, a secret re-education program run by the Provost Marshal General's office, reported increasing numbers of prisoners requesting access to American newspapers, books, and educational materials. Major Paul Newland reported in December 1943, "The prisoners no longer argue when shown production statistics. They have seen too much. The most fanatical Nazis have become quiet. They still maintain loyalty to Germany, but no longer speak of victory. Many openly question what they were told about America." The camp newspapers produced by prisoners themselves began reflecting this transformation. Der Ruff, published at Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, gradually shifted from defiant nationalism to discussions of democracy, economic systems, and post-war reconstruction. Lieutenant Hermann Goetz, captured with the 10th Panzer Division, wrote in a letter that passed American censors, "We were told America was a mongrel nation, weak, divided, controlled by Jews, incapable of military prowess. Every day I am here, I see the opposite. This is the most organized, unified, and powerful nation on earth. We were told fairy tales by criminals." Christmas 1943 delivered perhaps the most devastating psychological blow. American organizations, churches, and civic groups sent 500,000 Christmas packages to German prisoners, enemies who had been trying to kill American soldiers just months earlier. Each package contained cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and games. Local communities invited prisoners to Christmas dinners. At Camp Hearne, the local Methodist church choir performed Christmas carols in German. Women from Hearne sent homemade cookies and cakes. Boy Scouts deliver handmade Christmas cards. This kindness toward enemies shattered the final remnants of Nazi racial theory. Oberleutnant Walter Mueller, whose brother had died in the bombing of Hamburg, wrote with confusion and something approaching shame, "They know we are their enemies. Many have sons and husbands fighting against our armies. Yet they show us Christian charity, not propaganda, but genuine kindness. What kind of people treat enemies this way? Only those absolutely certain of victory and secure in their power." The Christmas feast itself defied comprehension. Turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, gravy, vegetables, pies, ice cream. Quantities of food that Germany hadn't seen since before the First World War. "We ate like kings," wrote Feldwebel Hans Bauer. "Better than German generals eat. Better than party leaders." And this was not special. The guards told us this was a normal American Christmas dinner, that every American family was eating the same meal. If they can feed prisoners this way, what must their own soldiers eat? By early 1944, over 40,000 German prisoners were enrolled in educational programs. They studied English, American history, mathematics, and sciences. The University of Chicago provided correspondence courses. Stanford University sent professors to lecture on democracy and economics. The thirst for knowledge was insatiable. Prisoners who had been told Americans were cultureless barbarians discovered libraries with millions of books, universities that welcomed all social classes, scientific research that led the world. Hauptmann Dr. Wilhelm von Braun, a physicist conscripted from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, attended lectures on atomic physics at Camp Shelby. He later wrote, "American professors, including Jewish refugees from Germany, taught us without hatred. They spoke of science as universal, belonging to all humanity. They were years ahead of German research, and they shared knowledge with enemies. This generosity of spirit was incomprehensible to minds shaped by Nazi ideology." The camp theater showed American films, not propaganda, but regular Hollywood productions. They watched Gone with the Wind, seeing a depiction of American defeat and recovery that resonated with their own situation. They saw The Grapes of Wrath, amazed that Americans would show such self-criticism to enemies. "They hide nothing," wrote Lieutenant Joseph Kramer. "They show their problems, their failures, their conflicts. Yet this honesty makes them stronger, not weaker. In Germany, such criticism would mean death. Here it is considered patriotic." June 6, 1944. News of the Normandy invasion reached the camps. German prisoners experienced their final ideological collapse. The scale of the operation: 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, 150,000 men in the first wave, demonstrated American organizational capacity beyond anything Nazi Germany had achieved. Prisoners at Camp Shelby watched newsreels of the invasion within days. They saw endless streams of ships, the artificial harbors, the supply system that delivered 15,000 tons daily across open beaches. They watched their homeland being crushed by the very nation they'd been told was too weak to fight. Oberst Friedrich von Stolberg-Wolter. We knew then that everything was lost, not just the war, but the entire Nazi project. We had challenged the world's greatest industrial power with fairy tales and racial mythology. We sent horses against their trucks, rifles against their automatic weapons, courage against their unlimited resources. But throughout their captivity, German prisoners experienced something that challenged Nazi ideology more than material wealth ever could: American humanity. When Gefreiter Hans Muller's son died in the Hamburg bombing, the American camp commander personally delivered the Red Cross message and offered condolences. When Lieutenant Paul Fisher's wife wrote that she was struggling to feed their children, American church groups sent food packages to her in Germany. Enemy civilians in a nation America was actively bombing. They separated the German people from the Nazi regime, wrote Feldman Otto. They said they were fighting Hitler, not Germans. This distinction, which seemed like propaganda, proved genuine. They prepared us to rebuild Germany after the war, not to destroy it. The medical treatment particularly affected prisoners. German doctors worked alongside American medical staff, learning new techniques, using advanced equipment. Prisoners received operations available only to elites in Germany. Mental health treatment, virtually unknown in the Wehrmacht, was provided to traumatized soldiers. Dr. Friedrich Bauer-Wolter. They treated attempted suicides with counseling, not punishment. Prisoners with mental breakdowns received therapy, not beatings. This humanity toward enemies revealed a strength we never understood: the confidence of true power. April 1945. As American forces liberated concentration camps in Germany, the footage was shown to German prisoners. Many refused to believe it initially, claiming it was propaganda, but the evidence was overwhelming. Testimony from American soldiers, photographs, newsreels, eventually, letters from Germany confirming the horror. The psychological impact was devastating. Men who had maintained some pride in German honor, despite military defeat, now faced complete moral collapse of their nation. Everything they had fought for was not just defeated, but evil. Feldman Walter Schmidt wrote the most eloquent summary: "We thought we were warriors for a great cause. We discovered we were tools of criminals. We believed we were bringing civilization to inferior peoples. We found that we were the barbarians. The Americans we called weak and decadent showed us what civilization actually meant." Between 1945 and 1946, 371,683 German prisoners were repatriated from American camps. They returned to a Germany divided, destroyed, and destitute, but they brought something precious: knowledge of how a democratic industrial society functioned. Many would rise to prominence in West Germany's reconstruction. Hans Kroll, prisoner at Camp Shelby, became West German ambassador to the United States. Walter Hallstein, who taught classes at Camp Como, became president of the European Commission. They brought American methods to German industry, American efficiency to German agriculture, American democratic ideals to German politics. We learned that prosperity came from freedom, not conquest. Hans Kroll wrote in his memoirs, "We saw that democracy created wealth, that diversity brought strength, that treating workers well increased production. These lessons, learned as prisoners, shaped the new Germany." In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of the war's end, over 500 former German prisoners returned to America for a reunion in Austin, Texas. Many brought their families to show them where their transformation had begun. Former Stabsfeldable Kurt Meyer, who had worked on Iowa farms, spoke with emotion. The farmers treated us not as enemies, but as young men far from home. They shared their meals, their knowledge, sometimes their homes. This humanity from people whose sons were fighting against us. This changed us forever. At the reunion dinner, former Oberst Hermann Goetz, then 78 years old, delivered the keynote address. We came to America as enemies, as Nazis, as believers in a lie. We left as friends, as Democrats, as men who had seen the truth. America showed us that strength comes not from conquest, but from production, not from hatred, but from diversity, not from tyranny, but from freedom. We witnessed the arsenal of democracy at full production. We saw farmers who produced food for the world, workers who built the tools of victory, citizens who treated enemies with dignity. We learned that America's true weapon was not its bombs or tanks, but its inexhaustible capacity for creation and its unshakable confidence. We returned to Germany with a mission: to build a society that could create rather than destroy, that could prosper through peace rather than war. The Germany that rose from the ashes was built on lessons learned in American prison camps. To America, from your former enemies, now your friends, thank you for showing us the way. The auditorium erupted in standing ovation. Americans and Germans together, former enemies united in recognition of a transformation that had seemed impossible when those first trains rolled into Texas in June 1943. The statistics tell an extraordinary story. 371,683 German prisoners held in America, over 500 camps across 45 states. Only 2,222 escape attempts, a rate of 0.6%. 0 successful permanent escapes. No American civilians harmed. Post-war surveys showed 95% rated their treatment as good or excellent. But the most remarkable statistic? Approximately 5,000 former prisoners immigrated to the United States after the war. Over 12,000 maintained correspondence with American families, an average duration of 31 years. The German prisoners who witnessed American industrial might didn't just see history. They were transformed by it. Their captivity became education. Their defeat became enlightenment. Their imprisonment became liberation from the ideological chains of Nazism. In the end, America's greatest victory wasn't on the battlefield. It was in the prison camps, where overwhelming evidence of democratic prosperity accomplished what armies could not: the complete transformation of enemy minds. The prisoners had arrived believing in German superiority and American weakness. They left knowing the truth. American industrial might wasn't just overwhelming. It was incomprehensible to minds shaped by scarcity and tyranny. But more than that, it was married to a humanity that refused to dehumanize even enemies. The trains that brought them into captivity in 1943 had carried warriors of the Third Reich. The ships that returned them to Germany in 1946 carried architects of democracy. They had seen the future. And it worked. Their story stands as testament to a profound truth. The most powerful weapon in America's arsenal wasn't military might. It was a simple, overwhelming evidence of what a free society could achieve when people worked together in dignity and freedom. The German prisoners were stunned by America's industrial power. But ultimately, they were converted by its humanity. In their transformation lay the seeds of Europe's post-war redemption and the final defeat of the Nazi dream. They returned to Germany not as defeated enemies, but as witnesses to what free societies could achieve. The economic miracle that transformed West Germany in the 1950s was built on foundations laid in American prison camps, where enemy soldiers learned that prosperity came not from conquest, but from freedom, not from racial superiority, but from human dignity, not from totalitarian control, but from democratic cooperation. The story of German prisoners of war in America is ultimately a story of redemption through revelation. It proves that sometimes the greatest victories are won not through destruction, but through demonstration, not through propaganda, but through prosperity, not through hatred, but through humanity. Their journey from Nazi warriors to democratic citizens remains one of the most remarkable transformations in modern history, accomplished not through force, but through the overwhelming evidence of what free people could achieve. In the end, that was America's secret weapon. Not just the ability to produce more tanks and planes than any nation in history, but the capacity to transform enemies into friends through the simple power of example. The German prisoners were stunned by America's industrial might. But more importantly, they were changed by it. And in that change lay the foundation for a better world. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe. The greatest lessons of history aren't found in battles. They're found in moments like these, when humanity triumphs over hatred. Share this video to remind others that even in our darkest wars, the light of human dignity can transform enemies into friends.